everybody, welcome to today's lesson, How to Win a Twitter Battle. Today, you are going to encounter a brilliant antagonist who seriously disagrees with your thesis, and you are going to win a Twitter battle with that antagonist by rebutting all of their counter arguments. So if you remember, what we've learned so far in this argumentative essay unit is first, you have come up with a controversial claim, an argument that you are going to make in your argumentative essay. You have connected personally to your argument by creating a photo essay. You have found credible evidence for your argument that you're going to incorporate into your essay. You're feeling great. You're like, I'm good to go. I've got this. But as Mike Tyson famously said, everybody has a plan until they get punched in the mouth. What we're going to do in today's lesson is to make sure you do not get punched in the mouth by being ready for any counter arguments that anyone could possibly make. So today we're going to talk about how to address counter arguments by having a Twitter battle. And after we do this, you're going to be ready to write your essay. So what you should have ready for today is your main argument, which you have already come up with. For example, as you remember, my argument is that college tuition should be free for everyone in the US. And then in our last class, you've created an imaginary antagonist and two Twitter accounts. One Twitter account is your own, and one is the Twitter account of your imaginary antagonist. If you need help or you missed the last class, video demos of the previous lessons are all posted on the class blog, or feel free to see me during office hours. Unlike Doug Antagonist, my imaginary antagonist, I'm glad to help. So today you're going to jump in and have a Twitter battle with your antagonist. And remember, your antagonist disagrees with you. So they are going to tweet out 4 separate counter arguments, and each of their counter arguments is going to include evidence and an explanation. And then you're going to rebut your antagonist's tweets with 4 tweets of your own. Now remember, you are actually playing both of these parts, which is going to make it complicated, but also really fun. Oh, it looks like we have a question coming in. Yes, Eliza.
Wait, these tweets are public?
I'm so glad you asked that, Eliza. Technically they're public, but the thing is that since your imaginary antagonist doesn't have any followers, then nobody is going to see those tweets. And if you've created a fake account for yourself, no one's going to see your tweets back to them either. And yes, you can definitely delete all of this when this whole exercise is done. We're going to step it out, because the first thing you're going to have to do is think through, okay, what are my antagonist's counter arguments going to be? And we're going to spend a little time on this because this is some really important thinking here. So basically, this is where the fun part begins, because you're going to have to imagine that you are somebody else. You're going to imagine that you're somebody who holds the opposite point of view of the one that you really have. And then you are going to think of 4 great counter arguments that this person would make against you. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to get out my counter argument brainstorming worksheet. You each have one of these Google Docs. I see we have a question coming in. Yes, David.
I don't feel like filling out a form. Can't I just freestyle it?
Excellent question, David. I'm so glad you asked. Feel free to use it or don't use it. For me, it always helps me to have a piece of paper in front of me and to be able to write things down when I'm brainstorming. But if you are a person who would rather freestyle it, you absolutely do not have to use this form. This is a college class. Do what you're comfortable with. But I'm going to write down my claim just so that I keep it in the front of my mind. So my claim is college tuition should be free for all in the US. And now I'm going to sit here and go, okay, I gotta think. I gotta think like Doug Antagonist. Doug Antagonist completely disagrees with me. What is he gonna say to try to defeat my argument? And the only thing that comes to my mind is what I've actually heard people say, which is that it isn't fair to all the people who've paid college tuition in the past. So I'm going to write that down. Not fair to people who've paid college tuition in the past. Now, before I go into finding credible evidence for it, I want to brainstorm all 4 counter arguments. It just keeps things simpler for me. I see there's a question. Yes, Rebecca, go ahead.
What if I can't think of 4 counter arguments?
A great question. I'm going to show you what I do when I'm stuck. That's when I'm going to hit Google. I'm going to search up the opposite of what I actually believe. I'm going to look for reasons to disagree with myself. So I'll type in why free college tuition is a bad idea. Ha. So I'm going to click on that. And I'm seeing there are plenty of listings here. So I'm just going to click on the first one. Why free college is a bad idea. Now, I'm going to look at, where is this? Norton Norris Inc. Okay, I'm going to put a pin in that in my mind because I've never heard of Norton Norris Inc., so that might be a red flag. But let's just look at what these reasons are and if they sound like, I never thought of that. So I'm just going to take a look at what this Norton Norris, whoever they are, site is saying. What are their arguments? College student persistence and success will decrease. Okay, my first reaction to that is, says who? Like, where's their evidence? They're going to have to present some evidence if they're going to persuade me of that. How will students choose where to study? Right now, notice that I'm just skimming because I'm not going to get in deep yet. I want to find some arguments that seem reasonable, that do not seem crazy. It's too easy if the other person is making a crazy argument. I'm actually going to look for an argument that makes me go, I didn't know that, or that's kind of interesting. So here they've got 7 reasons. And again, I'm not going to evaluate all of them. I'm just going to take a glance at them. Student loan defaults will increase. I'd like to see evidence for some of this stuff. Like, you can say that. A lot of this to me looks like, okay, this is a potentially interesting argument, but I really would need to see some evidence for it. But I'm thinking, okay, that might be some interesting stuff. I'm putting it all in the back of my mind. So I'm going to keep on scrolling and I'm going to find some other thoughts. And I'm seeing 5 reasons why free college doesn't make the grade. And I'm seeing that this is Forbes. Now, Forbes is a magazine that I've heard of. Doesn't automatically mean that it's credible. I'm going to look it up, but I have heard of it. So I'm going to take a look at what this guy, Michael B. Horn, is saying here. And his arguments are that they crowd out faster, cheaper options. That's interesting. That gives me pause. I'd like to see evidence, but it's also a really interesting idea, I have to say. It supports a subpar system, and I can see that he's backing this up with some evidence. Now, when I see that, I feel bad in a good way. What I mean is that that's a sign to me that this is probably a pretty good counter argument. I'm going to have to really take a look at this. So I'm making a mental note. I'm going to take a close look at that argument and at his evidence. Pay attention to your gut. If your heart sinks when you see somebody's counter argument, it might be a sign that that's a good counter argument and you are going to have to address it, which is going to make your argument stronger. Help those who need it the least and not those who need it the most. Most free college policies are regressive. Again, I'm getting that sinking feeling in the pit of my stomach, which means I'm seeing an argument that sounds persuasive to me. And that's bad, but it's also good because it means okay, I'm going to look at this, I'm going to look at his evidence, and then I'm going to be able to rebut it. I'm going to keep digging until I find 4 counter arguments that seem like strong arguments to me, even though it's really tempting to get an argument that you think, whoa, that's pretty stupid, I could easily rebut that. You actually want to go with a counter argument that seems pretty strong to you, because rebutting that will really strengthen your own argument. So I've found 4 arguments that I'm going to say are pretty strong for Doug to make against me. Strong counter arguments. And the next thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to look for credible sources that have evidence that Doug can use when he argues against me. Because when you start tweeting as your antagonist, you're not just going to be making an argument, you're going to have to be tweeting out credible evidence. I'm going to once again hit a search engine. I'm going to type in community college. Oh, graduation rates. Great. So now I'm going to look and see if I can find what I found before. 13% of community college students graduated in 2 years. That looks even worse than Doug said. Here's one that says fewer than 30% of community college students earn a certificate. Okay, that's very discouraging, actually, because it's true that if my argument is that college tuition should be free and more than 60% of community college students aren't even graduating, that does poke a hole in my argument, which is bad, but also good because I'm going to figure out a rebuttal. But right now, what I'm going to look at is the source. We're going to really be digging down into credible sources here, and I'm seeing Brookings.edu. Okay, first of all, I've heard of Brookings. But second of all, .edu means it's an educational institution. That's a sign that I can consider this credible. Oh, I see we have another question coming in. Yes, Jack.
How am I supposed to know if it's a credible source?
That's a great question, Jack. And here are the criteria that you're going to use. And they're right there on the worksheet, so you can follow along if you want. Again, if you don't want to, that's totally fine. But this is the filter that I use. Before I get too far into this article, I'm going to look at our criteria for what constitutes a credible source. One is source is listed within the green or yellow section of our infographic. You remember our infographic? It's on our class blog. So this is our media bias infographic, and I want you to check your source, if it's a news source, against this graphic, because we don't want sites that are so biased or so skewed towards propaganda that they really can't be believed. We want to look for sources that are within this green area, which means that they are at least somewhat reliable, and also that they're not so partisan. They don't go too far to the left, they don't go too far to the right. So for example, I am seeing Forbes here. If I want to use that Forbes article, I can. If it's not a news source, if it's a site, you want to make sure it's got a .edu, it's affiliated with a state university or well-known other private university. If it's neither of those things, but the author is named and has a Wikipedia entry as a journalist or an author specializing in this field, that will do it for me. Sometimes fake news, you can tell because there's no author cited. Or the source is affiliated with a nonprofit or a foundation, and that you've researched what this foundation does and they are not crazy. For example, on the Brookings Institution site, before I really start digging into that article, I'm going to click on the About section. And what I see here says the Brookings Institution is a nonprofit public policy organization based in Washington, D.C. This to me is credible enough. This combined with the fact that I've actually heard of it. And if you have questions, please see me, feel free to run something by me. But if they're a nonprofit public policy organization, I'm going to consider it credible. And I want to contrast that with that site that we looked at earlier, nortonnorris.com. Okay, .com might be a red flag if it's not a news organization, because that's an indication that it's a for-profit company. Nothing wrong with being for-profit, but it does mean that they have a bias. Their bias is ultimately they want you to buy stuff, and that makes their evidence less credible. So I'm going to once again look at their About section. I'm going to go to who we are, providing admissions and marketing solutions to colleges and university, blah, blah, blah. Okay, they sound cool. This sounds great. They're selling stuff, right? They're selling stuff to colleges and universities. So they should go and prosper and be happy, but we are not going to use them as a credible source. So now you've got your 4 counter arguments. You've got your credible evidence for those counter arguments. If you want to take a moment and pause the video so you can go back and make some notes or do any research that you want to, go ahead and do that now, and then come back in when you are ready to tweet. I'm going to log into my antagonist's Twitter account that we made together the other day, and I am going to go ahead and tweet. So I'm going to get into Doug's account, and first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to put in one of my articles. Now this is the one saying that college completion rates from community college are so bad, and then I'm going to write the actual tweet, and I'm going to tweet it at my own account so that I get it. So I'm going to say, hey, at Ellie Herman 8, that's me. Here's an argument saying that less than 40% of students even graduate from community college. What a waste of taxpayer money. And then I'm going to go ahead and tweet it at myself. I'm going to do that 4 times. 1 for each of my arguments. And then I'm going to log back into my Twitter account. I'm going to find my antagonist's tweets, and I'm going to respond with a response of my own. Now, for those of you who are new to Twitter, here is how you respond to a tweet. So if I see a tweet that I want to respond to, I move over to that little quotation bubble on the left, and I click on that, and then I will be able to type a response that he will then see in his Twitter feed. Remember that my response, or your response to your antagonist, must also include credible evidence of my own to rebut his. So this is actually where things get really hard in a great way. This is where the mental struggle really begins, because now Doug antagonist, or your imaginary antagonist, has challenged you to come up with a rebuttal to a really credible counter argument. And maybe 1 or 2 of those are things you've thought of before, but maybe a couple of them are things you have not thought of. And that can get really interesting. I have to admit that when I was thinking of Doug's arguments, a couple of the arguments that he was making really threw me. I hadn't thought about it before. So this is how I'm going to approach it. I mean, it may be that you come up with a counter argument right away, with a rebuttal right away. You're like, I can see the weakness in his argument. I'm going to go for it. I'm going to find evidence that shows that I'm right. But what if you're stumped? This is how I'm going to approach it. I'm going to look really closely at what he's saying. A key is often, what are the terms that he's using? What are the terms that your opponent is using? Can you examine those terms for weaknesses? For example, he's using the terms flawed system. The colleges are a flawed system. Well, now I'm thinking, that's not one of the laws of the universe. It doesn't have to be a flawed system if we don't decide that it's going to be a flawed system. So I'm going to go after him on that. And I recommend, if you can't think of a good rebuttal, look at the terms the other person is using. Are they definitely true, or are there some weaknesses? I'm going to decide that I'm going to rebut him by arguing about the idea of a flawed system. And when I searched up flawed education system, I found another article in Forbes magazine that I could use as evidence. So I tweeted that back at Doug Antagonist. You're going to have 4 tweets from your antagonists. Each one is going to have a counter argument to your central argument, and it's going to have credible evidence. Then you're going to respond to each tweet from your antagonist with an argument and credible evidence of your own for a total of 8 tweets, 4 from your antagonist and 4 from you. So there you go. You have now learned how to win a Twitter battle. You've learned some Twitter skills, but more importantly, on a deeper level, you have learned that when you're making an argument, it is really important to be able to identify and research evidence for counter arguments so that you can strengthen your argument by learning to rebut them. Let's review what you've learned today. You've learned how to find credible counter arguments by searching online. You've searched for what counter arguments are there. Then you've identified, is this a credible source? And you've looked at, what's the evidence? You've learned how to respond to a tweet, and you have learned how to rebut counter arguments with evidence. That's it for today. If you have any questions, please email me or come and see me during my office hours. And otherwise, happy tweeting, and I will see you for our next lesson when we begin to put together your argumentative essay using all of these counter arguments and successfully rebutting them. Thank you, and have a wonderful rest of your day.